Peace. Excuse me, family. It's your girl, Morgan. My name is Tuning in with you all with another reading of The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, the story time with More My. We're going to get right into the book. We just finished Jennifer Lewis's memoir, and we're towards the end of this book. And then I got some other reads that I want to get into with you guys. So we're on chapter 28. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. If you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do so. You can type in my name, Morgan Myers, M-Y-E-R-S, or you can type in Storytime with Moremy, M-O-R-E-M-Y, and subscribe, and you'll be able to catch up on all these readings, prior readings, and readings to come. All right, chapter 28. This is from timeline 1996 to 1999, and it's entitled After London. The story of Henrietta Lacks eventually caught the attention of a BBC producer in London named Adam Curtis, and in 1996, he began making the documentary about Henrietta that I would later watch in Courtney Speed's beauty parlor. When Curtis arrived in Baltimore with his assistants and cameras and microphones, Deborah thought everything would change, that she and the rest of the world would learn the true story of Henrietta Lacks and the Heli cells, and she would finally be able to move on. She started referring to periods in her life as before London and after London. Curtis and his crew covered the Lacks family story in more depth than anyone ever had, filling dozens of hours of video interviewing Deborah, prompting her from off camera to speak in complete sentences and not wander off topic. Deborah said things like, "I used to go into a corner after I was married. My husband didn't even know anything about me, just being sad and crying to myself. I just asked these questions in my head. Why, Lord, did you take my mother when I needed her so much?" The interviewer asked, "What is cancer?" The BBC interviewed Deborah in front of the home house in Clover. They shot Day and Sonny leaning on Henrietta's mother's tombstone, talking about what a good cook Henrietta was, and how they never heard anything about the cells until researchers called Lunch and Blood. And they followed the Lacks family to Atlanta for a conference organized in Henrietta's honor by Roland Patillo, the scientist who would soon steer me to Deborah. Patillo grew up in the 30s, the son of a blacksmith turned railroad worker in a small segregated Louisiana town. He was the first in his family to go to school, and when he learned about Henrietta at a postdoctoral fellow in Guy's lab, he felt immediately connected to her. He wanted to honor her contributions to science ever since. So on October 11, 1996, at Morehouse School of Medicine, he organized the first annual Heli Cancer Control Symposium. He invited researchers from around the world to present scientific papers on cancer in minorities, and he petitioned the city of Atlanta to name October 11th the date of the conference, Henrietta Lacks Day. The city agreed and gave him an official proclamation from the mayor's office. He asked Howard Jones to contribute an article reporting his memories of diagnosing Henrietta sooner. Jones wrote, "From a clinical point of view, Mrs. Lacks never did well. As Charles Dickens said at the beginning of A Tale of Two Cities, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But it was the best of times for science in that this very peculiar tumor gave rise to the Heli cell line. For Mrs. Lacks and the family she left behind, it was the worst of times. Scientific progress, and indeed progress of all kinds, is often made at great cost, such as the sacrifice made by Henrietta Lacks." Patillo got Deborah's phone number through a physician friend at Hopkins and called her. When she heard about his plans for the conference and the official naming of Henrietta Lacks Day, she was ecstatic. Finally, a scientist was honoring her mother. Soon, the Lacks family, Day, Sonny, Lawrence, Deborah, Babette, Zachariah, and Deborah's grandson, Devon, piled into an RV that Patillo rented for them and drove to Atlanta, with the BBC field crew following behind. At a gas station along the way, Deborah smiled into the camera and explained why they were headed to Morehouse. "They're going to have a lot of doctors there talking on different subjects in different areas of the science field," she said, "and they're going to hand out plaques to my brother and my father and me in honor of our mother's name. So I know it's going to be a great occasion." And it was. For the first time, the Lackses were treated like celebrities. They stayed in a hotel, people asked for their autographs, but there were a few glitches. In all the excitement leading up to the ceremony, Sonny's blood pressure shot up dangerously high, and he ended up in the hospital, nearly missing the whole event. Zachariah emptied the minibar in his room, then emptied his father's and Deborah's. He yelled and threw programs when he saw that they listed him as Joseph Lacks and Henrietta as the woman who donated the Heli cells. Deborah did her best to ignore all that. When she walked onto the stage, she was so nervous the podium shook when she touched it. She worried for weeks that there might be a sniper in the audience, a scientist who wanted to take her out to do research on her body or to keep the family from causing problems, but Patillo assured her she was safe. Poor girl. "Excuse me if I'm mispronouncing a word," she said. She told everyone at the conference, "but I have problems, and I didn't get the right teaching when I was coming up in school. I was not even allowed to have a hearing aid until I was grown, but I'm not ashamed of it." Then, with Patillo cheering nearby, Deborah cleared her throat and began her speech. "When Dr. Patillo called me, it all became real. For years, it seemed to be a dream, not knowing what was going on all these years, didn't know how to even talk about it. Can this about our mother be true? Not knowing who to go to for understanding, no one from the medical field took the time." Then, without so much as a pause, she began talking directly to her mother. "We miss you, Mama. I think of you all the time and wish I could see you and hold you in my arms like I know you held me. My father said that you told him on your dying bed to take care of Deborah. Thank you, Ma. We will see you again someday. We read what we can and try to understand. My mom often wondered how things would be if God had you stay here with me. I keep with me all I know about you deep in my soul because I am a part of you and you are a part of me. We love you, Mama." It seemed like things were going better for the Laxes, like Henrietta would finally begin getting the recognition Deborah hoped for. Soon the BBC showed up in Turner Station, asking locals about life there in the 40s and 50s. News of their visit, like news of everything else that happens in Turner Station, quickly found its way to Speed's Grocery, where Courtney Speed learned the story of Henrietta's lax for the first time. It felt like serendipity. Hold on, let me go back, because she said, the author said this is what she had heard. So in 1996, Adam began making a documentary about Henrietta that I would later watch in Courtney Speed's beauty parlor. Okay, when this author had first gone to Turner Station to interview a bunch of people about Henrietta, I think he sat her down and made her watch a documentary, and that was the documentary that she's talking about. Okay, gotcha. I'm up to speed now. So, news of their visit, like news of everything else that happens in Turner Station, quickly found its way to Speed's Grocery, where Courtney Speed learned the story of Henrietta Lacks for the first time. It felt like serendipity. She and several other women had recently founded the Turner Station Heritage Committee, and they were organizing events to bring attention to black people from Turner Station who contributed good things to the world. A former congressman who became president of the NAACP, an astronaut, and the man who won several Emmy Awards as the voice of Sesame Street's Elmo. When they learned about Henrietta and Heli Speed and a sociologist at Morgan State University named Barbara White, I don't know how to pronounce this, W-Y-C-H-E, White, we're going to go with White, Barbara White, went into overdrive. They wrote letters to Congress and the mayor's office demanding recognition of Henrietta's contribution to science. They also got in touch with Terry Sharver, a curator at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, who invited the Lacks family to a small event at the museum. There, Day admired old farm equipment and insisted that he wanted to see his wife sail. The museum had a flask of Heli in storage somewhere, the medium as dark as a murky pond, but it wasn't on display. People came up to Deborah with tears in their eyes and told her that her mother's cells had helped them overcome cancer. Deborah was thrilled. After hearing a researcher talk about cloning, Deborah asked Sharver whether it was possible to take DNA from Heli cells and put it into one of Deborah's eggs to bring her mother back to life. Sharver said no. After the event, Sharver wrote a letter to White suggesting that to commemorate Henrietta, she and Speed consider starting an African-American health museum in Turner Station. Okay, so after the event, Sharver wrote a letter to White suggesting that to commemorate Henrietta, she and Speed consider starting an African-American health museum in Turner Station. The woman soon founded the Henrietta Lacks Health History Museum Foundation Incorporation, with Speed as president. They planned events featuring Henrietta Lacks lookalikes and a few Turner Station women who style their hair like Henrietta's and wear suits identical to the one she wore in her iconic photo. To raise awareness of Henrietta's contributions, Speed used her own money to make and give away Henrietta Lacks t-shirts, and someone else made Henrietta Lacks pins. The local papers wrote about their plan for a $7 million museum, and Speed and White opened a Henrietta Lacks Foundation bank account, filed for a tax ID number, and began trying to collect as much money and information as they could for the museum. One of the first goals was getting a life-size wax Henrietta statue. Deborah wasn't appointed as an officer or foundation board member, but Speed and White called occasionally to ask if she speak at various celebrations honoring her mother, once under a small tent near Speed's grocery, other times at a nearby church. Eventually, someone suggested that Deborah donate Henrietta's Bible and the locks of hair from Henrietta and the leaves that she kept tucked inside. It was for safekeeping, people said, in case Deborah's house ever caught fire. When Deborah heard that, she ran home and hid her mother's Bible, telling her husband, "That's the only things I have from my mother. Now they want to take it." When she found out that Speed and White had started a foundation and bank account in her mother's name, Deborah was furious. "I would be too. How the hell y'all making money off my mama and we ain't getting a dime?" Oof, girl. She was furious. "The family don't need no museum, and they definitely don't need no wax Henrietta," she said. "If anybody collecting money for anything, it should be Henrietta's children collecting money for going to the doctor." Deborah only agreed to help with the museum project when it looked like Speed and White might turn up information about her mother. The three of them hung handwritten flyers in Speed's grocery store and around Turner Station asking who knew her favorite hymn, who knew her favorite scripture, who knew her favorite color, who knew her favorite game. The first two questions were Speed. The second two came from Deborah. At one point, Speed and White invited Guy's former assistant, Mary Beck, to an event in the basement of the new Shiloh Baptist Church in Turner Station to talk about how she grew HeLa cells. Mary stood wrapped in scarves on a huge platform stage, nervous and going blind, as distant blacks, cousins, and locals not related to Henrietta yelled questions from the audience, demanding to know who made money off the sales and whether Guy had patented them. "Oh, no," Mary said, shifting from foot to foot. No. There was no way to patent sales then." She told them that in the 50s, no one imagined such a thing might be possible someday. God just gave the sales away for free, she said, for the good of science. People in the room grumbled and tension grew. One woman stood up and said, "Them cells cured me of my cancer. If I got cells that can help somebody like her cells help me, I say take them." Another woman said she still believed God had patented the cells, then yelled, "I hope in the future this could be rectified." Deborah just fluttered around the room, saying that her mother had cured cancer and everyone should just be calm. Then she asked Mary to tell the story about seeing her mother's red toenails during the autopsy, the one Deborah had read in Gold's book. Mary did, and the audience fell silent. While Speed worked with other Turner Station residents to gather memories of Henrietta, White wrote letter after letter trying to get recognition for Henrietta and attract donors to pay for the museum, and she got results. The Maryland State Senate sent a resolution on fancy paper saying, "Be it hereby known to all that the Senate of Maryland offers its sincerest congratulations to Henrietta Lacks." On June 4, 1997, Representative Robert Ehrlich Jr. spoke before the U.S. House of Representatives saying, "Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to Henrietta Lacks." He told Congress a story saying Miss Lacks was not acknowledged as the donor of the cells. He said it was time for that to change. This, everyone seemed to believe, is where Hopkins should come in. White had been working on that. She'd written a meticulously detailed 3-page single-spaced letter to William Brody, then president of Johns Hopkins. She called Henrietta an unsung local hero, explaining the importance of the HeLa cells, and quoting a historian saying the HeLa story was one of the most dramatic and important in the history of research at the Johns Hopkins Medical Institution. She also wrote this: "The Lacks family has suffered greatly. This family is, like so many others today, attempting to grapple with the many questions and the moral and ethical issues that surround the birth of HeLa and the death of Mrs. Lacks. The question of, one, whether or not permission was received from the donor or her family for either the use of HeLa worldwide or the mass and commercial production, distribution, and marketing of Mrs. Lacks cells. Two, whether or not scientists, university, and government personnel and others have acted ethically in these two areas or in their interactions with the family, and other social issues also arise because Mrs. Lacks was an African-American woman." 1 month later, Ross Jones, assistant to the president of Hopkins, replied. He said he was uncertain what role Hopkins might play in any plan to celebrate Mrs. Lacks' life, but that he wanted to share this information with White. "Please let me emphasize that Hopkins never used the HeLa cells in a commercial venture. Hopkins never sought nor realized any money from the development, distribution, or use of the HeLa cell cultures." In keeping with almost universally accepted practice at the time, physicians and other scientists at Hopkins and elsewhere did not seek permission to use tissue removed as part of diagnostic and treatment procedures. Also, in keeping with traditions of academic research at the time, the cultures were shared freely without compensation in the good faith of scientists around the world who requested them. Indeed, willingness of Hopkins scientists to provide access to the cultures is perhaps the principal reason for the great benefits that have derived from their use. As I'm sure we both know, many standards of practice in academic medicine have changed drastically in recent years, and I hope and trust that there is increased sensitivity to and awareness of the wishes and interests of patients when they seek medical care or participate in research. That is all to the good for academic medicine and those we serve. He also told White that he had circulated her letter to others at Hopkins for comment and consideration. Soon, a small group of people at Hopkins began meeting unofficially without telling White or Speed to discuss what the university might do to honor Henrietta and the Lax family. Then they heard about Caulfield. Sir Lord Keenan Kester Caulfield was a cousin of Deborah's husband's former stepdaughter or something like that. No one in the family remembers for sure. They also don't know how or when he learned about Henrietta's sales. What they do remember is that one day, Caulfield called Deborah saying he was a lawyer and that she needed to protect herself and her mother by copywriting the name Henrietta Lacks. He also said he believed Hopkins was guilty of medical malpractice and that it was time to sue for the family's cut of all the money Henrietta's sales had earned since the 50s, a percentage of which he would take as his fee. He would charge nothing up front, and the Lacks wouldn't have to pay if he didn't win. Deborah had never heard about needing to copyright anything, but the family had always thought they should talk to a lawyer about the sales, and Caulfield sounded like one they could afford. Deborah's brothers were thrilled, and she soon introduced Caulfield to Speed and White as the family's lawyer. Caulfield began spending his days at Hopkins, digging through the medical school's archives, taking notes. Of all the people who come to the Laxes over the years talking about the sales, he was the first to tell the family anything specific about what happened to Henrietta at Hopkins. The way the Laxes remembered, his findings confirmed their worst fears. He told them that one of the doctors who treated Henrietta didn't have a medical license and that another had been expelled from the American Medical Association. On top of that, Caulfield said, Henrietta's doctors had misdiagnosed her cancer and might have killed her with an overdose of radiation. He told Deborah he needed to read her mother's medical records to investigate how the doctors had treated her and to document any possible malpractice. Since only Henrietta's family members were authorized to request her records, Deborah agreed to go with him to Hopkins, where she filled out a request form. But the photocopy machine was broke, so the woman behind the desk told Deborah and Caulfield they have to come back later once the machine was fixed. When Caulfield returned alone, the staff refused to give him the records because he wasn't a doctor or a relative of the patient. When Caulfield said he was Dr. Sir Lord Keenan Kester Caulfield, the Hopkins medical record staff contacted Richard Tidwell, one of Hopkins' attorneys. Tidwell got suspicious the moment he heard that someone was poking around Hopkins using the title Dr. Sir Lord, so he did some quick background research. Keenan Kester Caulfield wasn't a doctor or lawyer at all. In fact, Caulfield had served years in various prisons for fraud, much of it involving bad checks, and he spent his jail time taking law courses and launching what one judge called frivolous lawsuits. Caulfield sued guards and state officials connected to the prisons he'd been in and was accused of calling the governor of Alabama from jail and threatening to murder him. Caulfield sued McDonald's and Burger King for contaminating his body by cooking fries in pork fat, and he threatened to sue several restaurants for food poisoning, including the Four Seasons in New York City, all while he was incarcerated and unable to eat at any restaurants. He sued the Coca-Cola Company, claiming a bottle of soda he bought was filled with ground glass, though he was in prison that only offered Pepsi products in aluminum cans. He'd also been convicted of fraud for a scam in which he got an obituary of himself published. What? He'd also been convicted of fraud for a scam in which he got an obituary of himself published, then sued the newspaper for libel and damages up to $100 million. Oh my God. Dr. Sir Lord Keenan Kester Caulfield. What is this guy? He told the FBI that he filed at least 150 similar lawsuits. In various court documents, judges described Caulfield as a con artist, no more than a gadfly and an exploiter of the court system, and the most litigious inmate in the system. By the time Caulfield contacted the Laxes about suing Hopkins, he'd been banned from filing lawsuits in at least 2 counties. But Deborah knew none of this. Caulfield called himself doctor and lawyer and seemed capable of getting and understanding more information from Hopkins than the family ever could, and his demeanor didn't hurt. When Courtney Speed described him to me a few years later, she said charisma. Whew. I mean, cream of the smooth. One moment, let me get my charge on my phone back there. That is crazy. This man going around committing fraud. Why he messing with his family? Probably because he knew that they wasn't well versed in nothing. But that's how it be. You could do a little studying. They get what you want out of the court system. Alright, so she said, when Courtney Speed described him to me a few years later, she said, charisma, oof, I mean, cream of the smooth, very well versed and knew something about everything. When Kid Will learned the truth about Caulfield, the first thing he did was protect Deborah, something the Lax family never would have expected from someone at Hopkins. He told her that Caulfield was a con artist and had her sign a document forbidding Caulfield access to her family's records. The way everyone I talked to at Hopkins remembers it, when Caulfield came back and learned that the family had denied him access, he yelled and demanded copies of the records until a security guard threatened to physically remove him and call the police. Caulfield then filed a lawsuit against Deborah Lawrence, Courtney Speed, the Henrietta Lacks Health History Museum Foundation, and a long list of Hopkins officials: the president, the medical records administrator, an archivist, Richard Kidwell, and Grover Hutchins, the director of autopsy services. He sued 10 defendants in all, and several of the Hopkins employees involved had never heard of Caulfield or Henrietta Lacks before their subpoenas arrived. Caulfield accused Deborah, Speed, and the Museum Foundation of breach of contract for entering into an agreement that required him to have access to Henrietta's medical records, then denying him access. Hold on. Caulfield accused Deborah, Speed, and the Museum Foundation of breach of contract for entering into an agreement that required him to have access to Henrietta's medical records, then denying him access. He claimed that Deborah could not legally prohibit him from doing research for the Henrietta Lacks Health History Museum Foundation because she was not a member of its board of directors or officially involved with the foundation in any way. He also claimed racial discrimination, saying he was harassed by Negro security of Johns Hopkins and staff at the archives, and that the defendants' and employees' actions were all racially motivated and very anti-black. He demanded access to the medical records and autopsy reports of Henrietta and Deborah's sister, Elsie, as well as damages of $15,000 per defendant plus interest. The most astonishing detail of Caulfield's suit was his claim that the Lacks family had no right to any information about Henrietta Lacks because she'd been born Loretta Pleasant. Since there was no official record of a name change, Caulfield argued Henrietta Pleasant had never actually existed, and therefore neither had Henrietta Lacks. Whoever she was, he said, the family wasn't legally related to her. In a statement so filled with grammatical errors it's difficult to understand, Caulfield called this an obvious fraud and conspiracy, and claimed that his lawsuit would ultimately lead to the ends of justice for only Mrs. Henrietta Lacks, and now the plaintiff, who has become the victim of a small, big-time fraud. Piles of legal documents began arriving almost daily at Deborah's door, summonses and petitions and updates and motions. She panicked. She went to turn the station and burst into Speed's grocery store screaming, demanding that Speed give her everything she'd gathered related to Henrietta. The documents Speed kept in a superhero pillowcase, the Henrietta Lacks t-shirts and pants, the video of White interviewing Day in Speed's beauty parlor. Deborah yelled at Speed, accused her of conspiring with Caulfield, and said she was going to hire O.J. Simpson's lawyer, Johnny Cochran, and sue Speed for everything she had if she didn't shut down the foundation to stop all Henrietta-related activities. But Speed had nothing and was just as scared as Deborah. She was a single mother with 6 sons, and she planned to put all of them through college using money she made cutting hair and selling chips, candy, and cigarettes. Her store was being robbed regularly, and she was getting just as many court mailings from Caulfield as Deborah was. Soon, Speed stopped opening the letters and let them pile up in the back room of her store until they stacked 30 envelopes high. Then she started a new pile. She prayed to God for the letters to stop and wished her husband was still alive to deal with Caulfield. By the time the BBC documentary had aired and reporters were calling Deborah requesting photos of Henrietta and the family and asking questions about her mother and how she died, but Deborah still didn't know anything beyond what she read in Gold's book. It was time she decided to find out what her mother's medical records said, so she requested a copy from Hopkins along with a copy of her sister's records. She also met with Kidwell, who told her not to worry and promised that Hopkins will fight Caulfield. And it did. The case was eventually dismissed, but everyone involved was spooked. When the group of Hopkins that had been working on a plan to honor Henrietta heard about Caulfield's lawsuit, they quietly dropped the idea, never telling the Laxes they even considered it. Dang. When the group of Hopkins that had been working on a plan to honor Henrietta heard about Caulfield's lawsuit, they quietly dropped the idea, never telling the Laxes they even considered it. Dang, that's tough. Years later, when I talked to Grover Hutchins, the pathologist listed in Caulfield's lawsuit, he shook his head and said the whole thing was very sad. They wanted to have some kind of recognition for Henrietta, but when things got so hairy with Caulfield and the crazy things he was saying the family thought about Hopkins, they decided it was best to let sleeping dogs lie and not get involved in anything having to do with the Laxes. When I talked with John Hopkins' spokesperson, Joanne Rogers, she said there had never been an official effort by Hopkins to honor Henrietta. It was an individual effort, maybe one or two people, and when they went away, it went away. It was never an institutional initiative. Though the subpoenas had finally stopped coming, Deborah didn't believe the lawsuit was truly over. She couldn't shake the idea that Caulfield might send people to her house to steal her mother's Bible or the lock of hair she kept tucked inside it. Or maybe he tried to steal her sales, thinking they might be valuable like her mother's. She stopped checking her mail and rarely left the house except to work her shifts driving a school bus for disabled children. Then she was in a freak accident. A teenager on the bus attacked her, throwing himself on top of her, biting and scratching until two men ran onto the bus and pulled him off. A few days later, the same boy attacked her again, this time permanently damaging several discs in her spine. My God. Deborah had her husband hang dark curtains on their windows and stopped answering her phone. Then, sitting in her dark living room a year and a half after Caulfield's lawsuit ended, she finally began reading and rereading the full details of her mother's death and her medical records. And for the first time, she learned that her sister had been committed to a mental institution called Crownsville. She began worrying that something bad happened to her sister in that hospital. Maybe she was using some kind of research like our mother, she thought. Deborah called Crownsville for a copy of Elsie's records, but an administrator said most of Crownsville's documents from before 1955, the year Elsie died, had been destroyed. Deborah immediately suspected that Crownsville was hiding information about her sister, just as she still believed Hopkins was hiding information about Henrietta. Within hours of her call to Crownsville, Deborah became disoriented and had trouble breathing. Then she broke out in hives, red welts covering her face, neck, and body, even the soles of her feet. When she checked herself into a hospital, saying, "Everything going on with my mother and sister is making my nerves break down," her doctor said her blood pressure was so high she nearly had a stroke. A few weeks after Deborah came home from the hospital, Roland Patillo left a message on her answer machine saying he'd been talking to a reporter who wanted to write a book about Henrietta and her sales, and he thought Deborah should talk to her. That reporter was me. Lord have mercy. Oh, this is too much. Alright, we're going to stop here. That was chapter 28. This poor woman's life and her children's, golly. Thank y'all for tuning in. We'll be back on another day to finish up this book. Appreciate y'all. Have a good day.